Sarah Wills had never been the kind of person to believe in the supernatural. Sure, she enjoyed a good ghost story every now and then, but those were always things that happened to other people, never to someone like her. As a graphic designer in the bustling city of Seattle, her life was more about deadlines, creative briefs, and finding the perfect shade of blue for her next project. So when her vision started to blur unexpectedly, she thought it was nothing more than the result of too many late nights staring at a screen. Maybe a little eye strain, nothing serious. Little did she know, her world was about to shift in a way she could never have imagined. It started as a minor inconvenience. A little blurriness here and there, a few headaches that she chalked up to stress. But when her doctor recommended she stay overnight at Mercy General for observation, Sarah felt a flicker of unease. Hospitals weren't exactly her favorite places to be. Who really enjoys spending time in one? But this was supposed to be simple. Just a night of monitoring, a couple of tests, and she'd be back at work the next day. That was the plan. Mercy General was a standard hospital, nothing special about it, but Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that something was off the moment she checked in. The night she spent at the hospital was quiet, too quiet, the kind of quiet that makes you feel like something is watching, even though you know no one is there. As she lay in the uncomfortable hospital bed, surrounded by sterile white walls and the faint beeping of machines, Sarah felt a growing tension in the pit of her stomach. It was the kind of feeling you get when you're walking home alone late at night, and you start to sense someone behind you, even though you don't see them. Her eyes scanned the dimly lit room, trying to push away the rising paranoia. Sleep came, but it wasn't peaceful. Sarah drifted in and out of strange, unsettling dreams, her vision blurring in and out of focus. When she awoke in the middle of the night, the room seemed darker than before, the air thicker, almost suffocating. She blinked several times, but the blurriness only got worse. Something wasn't right. She could feel it. Her hand instinctively reached for the call button, but she hesitated. What could she possibly tell the nurse? That the room felt strange? That her vision was worse than when she arrived? As the hours passed, Sarah began to notice something even more peculiar. The usual hospital sounds, the hum of machines, the footsteps of nurses in the hall, seemed to fade. Instead, there was a strange silence, like the entire floor had emptied out. She glanced at the clock on the wall, but the numbers were fuzzy. It was hard to tell if time was moving or standing still. A cold draft crept through the room, making her shiver. The feeling of being watched grew stronger, and Sarah's heart began to race, though she still had no idea why. Finally, the nurse came to check on her. Sarah mentioned the blurry vision, the strange coldness, but the nurse brushed it off. "It's just the air conditioning, hon. Try to get some sleep." That was it. No tests, no reassurances. Just a pat on the shoulder and the promise that things would be better in the morning. Sarah wanted to believe her, but as the nurse left the room, she felt more alone than ever. Something was wrong with this place, and deep down, Sarah knew she wasn't going to find answers in the morning. That night, as she lay awake staring at the ceiling, the real nightmare began. The shadows in the corners of her room seemed to stretch and grow, creeping closer with each passing minute. Her vision blurred even more, and her heart pounded in her chest. Was this just her mind playing tricks on her? Or was something far more sinister lurking in the shadows? As the night wore on, Sarah's vision only worsened. The shadows in the corners of her room weren't just dark spots anymore. They seemed to move, shifting in the edges of her sight. It wasn't normal, but then again, what was normal about anything that was happening to her? She could barely make out the shapes around her, but she was certain that the figures she was seeing weren't part of her imagination. Her heart raced, and a cold sweat broke out across her skin. Something wasn't right, and she could feel it deep in her bones. The quiet of the hospital had turned eerie, like the calm before a storm. At first, she thought it might just be her eyes playing tricks. Maybe the medication or the exhaustion was getting to her. But then, through the haze of her blurred vision, she noticed them. Shadowy figures moving slowly past the door to her room. They weren't walking. They were drifting, almost like they were gliding along the floor. Sarah blinked several times, hoping her eyes would clear, but no amount of blinking made the figures disappear. Their hollow, bleeding eyes locked onto her, and for a moment she couldn't breathe. It was as if the air had been sucked out of the room, leaving her gasping in the sudden, suffocating cold. With trembling hands, Sarah pressed the call button, her pulse racing in her ears. She waited, the seconds feeling like hours, until finally the nurse arrived. When the door swung open, the shadowy figures were gone, as if they had never been there in the first place. Sarah stammered, trying to explain what she had seen, but the nurse looked at her with a mixture of confusion and concern. "There's nothing out there, hon," the nurse said, her voice gentle but firm. "You've been through a lot today. It's probably just your eyes adjusting." But Sarah wasn't so sure. She could still feel the cold that had settled into her bones, the strange, unnatural draft that seemed to follow those figures wherever they went. As the nurse checked her vitals, Sarah noticed that the room still felt different, as if the walls themselves were closing in on her. The nurse didn't seem to notice the chill in the air, or the lingering sense of dread that Sarah couldn't shake. It was like she was blind to whatever was haunting the hospital, while Sarah was the only one who could see it. After the nurse left, the room felt even darker, the silence more oppressive than before. Sarah's heart pounded in her chest as she strained to hear any sound that might give her a clue as to what was happening. But there was nothing, just the quiet hum of the machines and the faint, distant sound of footsteps in the hall. Or was it footsteps? It sounded like something else, something slower and more deliberate, like the shuffling of feet that weren't quite human. Sarah couldn't bring herself to close her eyes. Every time she blinked, she feared that when she opened them again, the figures would be closer, their bleeding eyes watching her every move. She tried to convince herself that it was all just a hallucination, that she was imagining things in the darkness of the hospital room. But the cold, creeping fear told her otherwise. Something was wrong with this place, something deeply, horribly wrong. As the night dragged on, Sarah knew one thing for sure. Whatever those shadowy figures were, they weren't gone. They were still there, somewhere in the hospital, and they weren't finished with her yet. The darkness in the room felt alive, like it was watching, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. The next night came, and with it, a deeper sense of dread. Sarah's vision had worsened to the point where she could barely see anything at all. Shapes and figures were now just blurs of shadow, and every time she tried to focus, her eyes only betrayed her further. It was like the world was slowly fading, and in its place, something darker was creeping in. The whispers started then, soft at first, almost imperceptible, but unmistakably there. They were speaking in a language she didn't understand, a guttural, ancient sound that sent shivers down her spine. She strained to listen, but the words made no sense, only filling her with a growing sense of terror. As the whispers grew louder, Sarah began to notice the figures again. They were no longer just drifting past her door. Now they were inside her room, hovering near the corners, just out of reach. Their eyeless faces were turned toward her, dark sockets dripping with what looked like thick black fluid. Every time they appeared, the temperature in the room would drop, her breath fogging in the cold air. She wanted to scream, to call for help, but something inside her knew that no one would come. The nurses would see nothing, just like before, and she would be left alone with the horror that only she could perceive. The worst part was that the figures were getting closer. Each time they reappeared, they seemed to inch nearer to her bed, their hollow eyes fixed on her as if they were drawn to something inside her. Sarah could feel their presence more than she could see them, a suffocating pressure that weighed heavy on her chest, making it hard to breathe. She reached out to touch the call button again, but it felt futile. What good would it do? The nurses couldn't help her. No one could. She was trapped in this nightmare, and it was becoming harder and harder to distinguish between what was real and what wasn't. The whispers continued to swirl around her, their tone shifting from soft murmurs to harsh, violent hisses. They seemed to echo inside her head, filling her with a growing sense of panic. Every time she tried to move, to escape the bed and run, her body betrayed her, sinking deeper into the stiff mattress as if something unseen was holding her in place. It was like the hospital itself had become a prison, and Sarah was its newest prisoner, doomed to face whatever terror lurked within its walls. Desperate to leave, Sarah tried to stand, but the moment her feet touched the cold tile floor, a wave of dizziness overtook her. The shadows at the edges of her vision swirled like black smoke, and the figures seemed to multiply, their twisted forms now filling the room. She stumbled, barely able to make it to the door, her hands gripping the cold metal handle. But when she tried to pull it open, it wouldn't budge. Panic rose in her throat. The door was locked. Or worse, something was keeping her from leaving. She collapsed back into the bed, her mind racing. No matter how much she tried, every attempt to leave brought her back to the same place, the same bed, as if the hospital itself was trapping her. The figures loomed closer now, their faces barely inches from hers. She could feel the coldness of their breath, hear the whispers in her ears. It was as though they were waiting for something, for her to give in, to surrender. Sarah's heart pounded in her chest, each beat like a countdown to the inevitable. In the dark, cold room, Sarah realized with a sinking feeling that there was no escape. The hospital, these figures, the whispers, they were all part of something much bigger than her, something she couldn't understand, let alone fight. And whatever it was drawing closer with every passing second. By the third day, Sarah's world had dissolved into total darkness. Her sight, once just blurry and unreliable, was now completely gone. She couldn't see a single thing, not even shadows or light. It was as if her eyes had been swallowed by an abyss. Panic gripped her, more intensely than ever before. The hospital felt eerily empty, a void filled with silence. The nurses, the doctors, where were they? Hours passed and still no one came to check on her. She strained to hear the faintest sounds of life beyond her door, but all that reached her ears was the unsettling echo of her own breathing. She was alone, or at least that's what she tried to convince herself. But the truth was much more terrifying. Even though her vision was gone, Sarah could feel them, those figures she had seen before. They were closer now, their presence undeniable. The air grew colder, the silence shattered by the sound of slow, dragging footsteps outside her door. The familiar whispers returned, but they were louder this time, more insistent. They no longer felt distant or detached. It was as if the voices were coming from inside her room, circling around her bed, like a predator stalking its prey. She clenched her fists, her heart hammering in her chest, waiting for whatever was outside to finally reveal itself. And then they came. Sarah felt the first touch, cold, clammy fingers brushing against her skin. It was barely noticeable at first, a feather-light sensation, but soon it became more intense. The hands were everywhere, grazing her arms, her neck, her face. She couldn't see them, but she knew they were there, surrounding her, their eyeless faces mere inches from hers. She wanted to scream, to call for help, but no sound would come. Her throat felt tight, as if the very air was being stolen from her lungs. She was trapped, paralyzed by fear, unable to move or make a sound. In the pitch-black room, the voices turned to screams, agonizing, bone-chilling screams that filled her head. They were relentless, tearing through the silence like a violent storm. Sarah pressed her hands over her ears, trying to block them out, but it was useless. The screams echoed inside her mind, growing louder, more desperate. She could feel the weight of their presence pressing down on her, suffocating her with their despair. Whatever these things were, they were not human. They were something else, something dark and ancient, feeding off her fear. Hours passed, or maybe it was just minutes. Time had lost all meaning. The darkness seemed to stretch on forever, swallowing everything in its path. Sarah was no longer sure if she was awake or trapped in some horrible nightmare. But one thing was clear. She wasn't alone. Not anymore. The figures, the whispers, the cold hands, they had claimed her. She could feel them around her, like invisible chains binding her to the bed. There was no escape. They were here, and they weren't going to let her go. As the screams subsided, Sarah felt something even more disturbing, a deep, guttural growl like a beast lurking in the shadows. It was low at first, barely audible, but it grew louder, more menacing. She could feel it vibrating through the floor, through the bed, through her very bones. Whatever was making that sound, it was close, closer than she had ever imagined. The presence was so overwhelming, so suffocating, that she felt like she was drowning in it. The darkness was no longer just a lack of sight. It was alive, pulsing, breathing, waiting. Sarah lay there, helpless, as the growl grew louder, the figures closing in around her. She could feel their breath on her skin, their cold fingers gripping her tightly. They were here for her, and there was no one left to save her. Sarah couldn't remember how she escaped that hospital, or if she ever truly did. All she knew was that her life had never been the same since. Her vision never returned, leaving her in perpetual darkness. But what haunted her most was the feeling that she had never really left that hospital room. Every night, when she lay in her bed, she could feel them, the cold hands, the eyeless figures. It was as if they had followed her home, slipping into her life like shadows that couldn't be shaken off. The darkness wasn't just in her eyes anymore. It had seeped into her soul, and she could feel them lurking, always watching, always waiting. She tried to go back to her normal routine, convincing herself that it was just trauma, that the hospital stay had messed with her mind. But the whispers were always there. Sometimes they were faint, just a murmur in the back of her head. Other times they were deafening, loud enough to make her cover her ears and scream for them to stop. But they never did. Every time she closed her eyes, she could hear the guttural sounds, the same language she didn't understand, the same voices that had filled her hospital room. Sleep had become impossible. Every time she drifted off, she was jolted awake by the feeling of cold air brushing across her face, or the unmistakable sensation of fingers grazing her skin. No one else seemed to notice it. Friends, family, doctors. Everyone assured her that it was just her mind playing tricks on her. But Sarah knew better. She knew that the figures were real, that they were still out there, and they weren't done with her yet. Each night they came closer, their presence more palpable, their whispers more urgent. There were nights when she could feel them standing at the foot of her bed, watching her, waiting for her to close her eyes. And then there were times when she swore she felt the bed sink, as if something or someone was sitting beside her. She would lie perfectly still, her heart pounding in her chest, too terrified to move or make a sound. She could feel their breath on her neck, the icy touch of their hands, but no matter how much she prayed or begged, they never left her alone. They were always there, just out of reach, but never far enough to escape. The worst part was the growing realization that these figures, these shadows, weren't just haunting her, they were waiting for her. They were waiting for her to join them, to step into their world. Every time she closed her eyes, she could see them, their bleeding sockets staring into her soul, beckoning her to come closer. It was as if they were trying to pull her into the same void of darkness that had taken her sight. And deep down, Sarah knew that it was only a matter of time before they succeeded. She no longer felt safe in her own home. No matter where she went, she could feel them watching. The cold drafts that followed her were unmistakable, the whispers constant, a reminder that she couldn't outrun them. The hospital may have been left behind, but the figures had become a part of her life now. She was trapped in their grasp, unable to break free from the hold they had over her. Every time she stepped into the dark, every time she blinked, she could feel them pulling her closer, dragging her into their world. Sarah knew that one day they would come for her. They were patient, waiting for the moment when her defenses were down, when she was too tired to fight back. And when that day came, she would have no choice but to follow them into the darkness. The hospital may have been the beginning, but this was far from over. Michael Barnes never thought much about hospitals. For him, they were just places people went to get fixed, nothing more. But that particular evening, when he decided to visit his friend recovering from surgery at St. Vincent's Hospital, something felt different. St. Vincent's wasn't like the sterile modern hospitals he'd been to before. It was an old, sprawling building with wings that had clearly been added over decades, twisting and turning like a maze. As he sat in the waiting area, scrolling through his phone to pass the time, boredom began to gnaw at him. His friend was still asleep, and the nurses seemed too busy to provide updates. So, with nothing else to do, Michael's eyes wandered to the dimly lit corridors beyond. Without really thinking about it, Michael got up and began exploring. The further he walked, the quieter it became, as though the walls themselves were absorbing all the sounds from the bustling hospital. His feet carried him deeper into the less frequented parts of the building, places where the lights flickered and the air seemed colder. It didn't take long before he found himself in front of a large, heavy door marked, "No entry." Now, curiosity is a funny thing, isn't it? It has this way of making you feel like you have to know what's behind that door, even when every part of your brain says not to. That was exactly what happened with Michael. With just one glance, he knew he was going in. The door creaked open with a groan that echoed down the empty hallways. The air inside was colder, a lot colder, and there was a musty smell, like a place that hadn't been touched in years. Michael stepped inside, his shoes crunching on dust that seemed to cover everything. The room was wide and dim, lit only by a few overhead lights that flickered intermittently. As he scanned the room, he realized it wasn't just any old storage space. This was a morgue. The sight of the old metal drawers lining the walls sent a chill down his spine. There was something unsettling about it, but he couldn't put his finger on why. He figured it was just the idea of being in a place where bodies had once been stored, and tried to brush off the creeping unease. Still, as Michael walked further into the room, a strange draft blew from the darkness, carrying with it a sense of something off. You know that gut feeling when something's just not right. Yeah, that's what hit him. The kind of feeling that starts at the base of your spine and works its way up to the back of your neck, making the hairs stand on end. But he ignored it, brushed it off. After all, this was just an old part of the hospital that no one used anymore, right? No big deal. But as Michael stood there, the silence pressing in, the air growing colder by the second, that feeling of wrongness didn't leave. If anything, it got stronger. Michael turned to leave, thinking it was probably best to get back before someone caught him snooping around where he shouldn't be. But just as he reached the door, he hesitated, glancing back over his shoulder at the darkened room. Something about this place felt like it had a story to tell, one that he wasn't sure he wanted to hear but couldn't walk away from either. And that was when it started. The flicker of lights that seemed a little too intentional, the sound of something faint, like a distant groan or a whisper, barely audible but unmistakable. He stopped in his tracks, his heart beginning to race as he strained to listen. The silence in the room was the kind that made your ears ring, like when you're deep underwater and everything around you just stops. Michael felt it, pressing in from all sides, as if the room itself was holding its breath. The flickering lights above him made everything worse, casting strange, shifting shadows that danced across the metal trays lining the walls. It was then that he realized how old everything looked, the trays smeared with dust, like they hadn't been touched in years. Each one of them seemed to carry a weight, a history, like they'd witnessed things no one should ever see. As Michael walked deeper into the room, the oppressive silence grew. It was too quiet. The kind of quiet that makes you uncomfortable, like something is watching you, waiting. He tried to shake off the feeling, telling himself it was just his imagination running wild. But when the first sound broke through that thick silence, a soft, metallic scrape, his blood ran cold. He stopped, his breath catching in his throat, and listened. There it was again, the unmistakable sound of something sliding. He turned, eyes darting around the room, but nothing seemed out of place. Yet the sound persisted, growing louder, more deliberate. Michael's heartbeat quickened as the sliding noise was joined by another sound, this time the soft rustle of fabric. Body bags. That's what it sounded like. Body bags being unzipped. The realization hit him like a punch to the gut. His mind raced, trying to make sense of what he was hearing. It had to be a trick of the acoustics, maybe something from another part of the hospital, carried through the vents, but deep down, he knew that wasn't it. These sounds weren't distant. They were right there with him, in the room. And that's when the lights went out. Complete darkness swallowed him whole, leaving Michael standing in the middle of an abandoned morgue, surrounded by the sounds of the dead. His breathing became shallow, panic rising in his chest. He fumbled for his phone, his hands shaking so badly that it took him a moment to find the flashlight. When he finally switched it on, the narrow beam of light cut through the dark, illuminating the rows of trays. They were still. But then, out of the corner of his eye, he saw movement. A drawer slowly sliding open. Michael's heart pounded in his ears as he shone the light on the drawer. It was moving, definitely moving, but there was no one there. No one alive anyway. The metallic groan of the tray being pulled out was deafening in the quiet room. He could feel the panic building, like a tidal wave threatening to crash over him. His instincts screamed at him to run, to get out of there, but his feet felt rooted to the spot. He didn't want to see what was in that drawer, and yet he couldn't look away. Then came the groaning. Low, guttural, like something ancient and restless was waking up beneath the floor. Michael's breath hitched as the noise grew louder, filling the room with its eerie resonance. The drawers began to creak open one by one, as if the bodies inside were stirring, coming to life. He felt the weight of their unseen gazes pressing down on him, suffocating him. The air grew colder, and the groans turned to whispers, indistinct, but terrifying in their persistence. He couldn't understand what they were saying, but he didn't need to. He knew it was time to leave. Desperation clawed at Michael as he turned and bolted for the door. His hands reached for the handle, but it wouldn't budge. He yanked it, hard, but it was no use. The door was stuck, or maybe it had locked itself. He wasn't sure, and right now, he didn't care. All he knew was that he was trapped in a morgue, surrounded by things that shouldn't exist. The room seemed to close in on him, the shadows growing thicker, more oppressive. He pounded on the door, yelling for help, but his voice seemed to get swallowed by the silence outside. As the groans and whispers swirled around him, Michael felt the cold seeping into his bones. He couldn't shake the feeling that whatever was waking up in that room wasn't done with him yet. The door might have been closed, but something far worse was wide open now, and he knew deep down that once it started, there was no going back. The darkness wrapped around Michael like a suffocating blanket, thick and impenetrable. His flashlight flickered, casting shaky beams of light that barely reached the edges of the room. That was when he felt it, the unmistakable sensation of something brushing against his skin. It was cold, far colder than the room itself, and the touch was light, almost curious. Michael froze, his breath catching in his throat as the icy fingers seemed to linger, pressing just enough to send a chill racing down his spine. He wanted to move, to run, but his feet wouldn't obey. Fear had paralyzed him. The groaning that had filled the room earlier was now accompanied by a new sound. Something heavier, something dragging. Metal clanked softly, and Michael's eyes darted to the source, but he couldn't see much through the dim light. His flashlight beam caught glimpses of movement, shadows shifting. But the most terrifying part was the sound of the morgue drawers sliding open, one by one. He could hear them, creaking and grinding against the old metal tracks as if the dead were waking up, stretching from a long sleep. The air grew colder still, and that icy touch returned, this time gripping his wrist. Michael jerked back, stumbling against the door behind him. He pounded on it again, shouting for someone, anyone, to help, but the only answer was the low, guttural groans coming from the depths of the morgue. The cold hands didn't stop. They moved over his arm, his shoulder, each touch more insistent than the last. His heart hammered in his chest, and panic clawed at the edges of his mind. The shadows around him seemed to pulse with life, twisting and writhing, taking on shapes that his mind struggled to comprehend. He could almost make out figures, distorted and half-formed, moving toward him. The fear that had held him still finally broke, and Michael moved, slamming his body against the door in a desperate attempt to escape. The cold hands grabbed at him again, this time tighter, pulling him back toward the center of the room. He screamed, the sound echoing off the walls, but it didn't seem to matter. No one was coming. The darkness seemed to swell, swallowing the light from his phone, and he realized with growing horror that he wasn't alone anymore. There were things in the room with him, things that had been waiting for someone like him to come along. The whispers returned, louder now, more distinct. They were angry, filled with an ancient malice that made Michael's skin crawl. He could hear the words, but they made no sense, a language long forgotten by the living. The shadows closed in, and he could feel the cold hands pulling him toward the center of the room, where the open morgue drawers waited. He fought, kicking and thrashing, but the cold grips only tightened. It was as if the room itself had come alive, determined to claim him as its own. His screams grew more frantic as the icy fingers gripped his ankles, dragging him across the cold floor. His flashlight flickered, and for a brief moment, he caught a glimpse of one of the figures, a twisted, decayed thing with hollow eyes and a mouth frozen in a silent scream. Its hand was on him, pulling him closer to the yawning darkness of the open drawers. He was no longer sure what was real, what was imagined, but the pain and fear coursing through him were undeniable. In his desperation, Michael kicked out again, connecting with something solid. For a brief moment, the hands released him, and he scrambled back to the door, pounding on it with all the strength he had left. The room groaned in response, the air thick with the smell of decay, and Michael knew, deep down, that he was running out of time. The dead were awake, and they weren't going to let him leave so easily. Just when Michael thought he couldn't take it anymore, there was a sound, soft but distinct, the creak of the door. It didn't swing open quickly or dramatically, but instead with a slow, deliberate groan that sent a chill down his spine. Without thinking, Michael bolted for the gap, his legs moving faster than his mind could process. He stumbled through the doorway, gasping for air as if he'd been underwater for far too long. The cold, oppressive air of the morgue was replaced with the slightly warmer, though still unsettling, atmosphere of the hospital. He could hardly believe it. He was out. His heart pounded in his chest, and his body felt heavy, like the weight of whatever had been inside that room was still pressing down on him. As he caught his breath, he glanced back at the morgue door. It was wide open now, revealing nothing but darkness inside. Part of him wanted to slam it shut, to seal whatever was in there away forever. But he didn't. He couldn't bring himself to go near it again. Instead, he turned and began walking down the hallway, his legs shaky, the adrenaline coursing through his veins. As Michael made his way toward the more populated areas of the hospital, he tried to shake off what had just happened. He needed to talk to someone, anyone. The first nurse he saw, he approached, his words coming out in a rush, barely coherent. But as he described the morgue, the sounds, the cold hands, the nurse's expression shifted from concern to something else. Disbelief, maybe even amusement. She nodded along, offering him calm reassurances about stress and fatigue. Michael knew she didn't believe him. He could see it in her eyes. To her, he was just another patient suffering from some kind of hallucination. Frustration boiled inside him. This wasn't a hallucination. He had felt those icy fingers. He had heard the drawers sliding open, but there was no point in arguing. The hospital staff wasn't going to take him seriously. He had to get out of there, as far away from the morgue as possible. Michael hurried toward the exit, his mind racing, still trying to make sense of what had happened. Maybe once he was out of the hospital, the cold feeling in his bones would leave him. Maybe it was just the atmosphere, the isolation of that room, that had played tricks on his mind. But as he reached the sliding doors that led outside, he hesitated. The hospital exit was just a few feet away, but something stopped him. It was subtle at first, a cool breeze on the back of his neck. Michael turned slowly, his eyes scanning the empty hallway. And that's when he saw it, just a shadow at first, barely noticeable, lingering at the far end of the corridor. It wasn't moving, but he could feel it watching him, as if it was waiting. The cold sensation he thought he'd left behind in the morgue was back, creeping along his skin like frostbite. Michael's breath caught in his throat, and for a moment, he thought about going back, about confronting whatever was watching him. But the fear was too strong. Instead, he turned and hurried out of the hospital, the shadow's presence still lingering in the back of his mind. He could feel it, even as he stepped into the fresh air outside, like it had followed him. The days after Michael's escape from the hospital should have been a relief. He was back in the comfort of his own apartment, away from the sterile, cold walls of St. Vincent's. But the unease followed him. It started subtly, the way unsettling things often do. At night, as he lay in bed, there was a persistent sound that he couldn't shake. The soft, metallic scrape of metal trays sliding, almost like it had in the morgue. At first, he convinced himself it was just his imagination. After all, it's not uncommon for the mind to play tricks after a traumatic experience, right? But then, it started to get worse. The groaning sounds, low and distant, began to echo through his apartment at odd hours. Sometimes, it would happen right as he was about to fall asleep, jolting him awake, his heart racing, sweat forming on his brow. Other times, he'd hear it in the early morning, just as dawn began to creep through the windows. The groans were faint, but unmistakable. They sounded just like they had in the morgue, and no matter how much he tried to rationalize it, Michael couldn't escape the sinking feeling that something had followed him home. During the day, things weren't much better. Whenever Michael walked past a hospital, even a completely different one, the cold returned. It was a biting chill that seeped into his bones, just like what he'd felt that night in the morgue. His body would tense up, and he couldn't bring himself to look too closely at the hospital's entrance. It was as though every hospital was connected to that same morgue, all of them waiting for him to return. The feeling of being watched was constant, even when he was sure he was alone. The nightmares began not long after. Every night, the same twisted visions haunted his sleep. He'd find himself back in the morgue, but this time, the drawers were all open. Dark, shadowy figures would crawl out from them, their hollow eyes fixed on him, their skeletal fingers reaching out to pull him closer. No matter how fast he ran, he could never escape. He'd wake up in a cold sweat, his heart pounding so hard it felt like it might burst from his chest, and each time he could still feel those icy hands on his skin, even after waking. Michael knew it wasn't just his mind playing tricks. The sounds, the cold, the nightmares, they were all too real. Something had followed him out of that morgue, something that wasn't going to let him go. He tried to avoid hospitals altogether, but even that didn't help. The presence was with him no matter where he went. It was subtle at first, like a shadow that lingered just out of sight. But as the days went on, it grew stronger. He could feel it watching him, waiting for the right moment to strike. As much as Michael wanted to believe he had escaped the morgue, deep down, he knew the truth. The dead hadn't let him go. They were still with him, still pulling at him from the other side. The door to the morgue might have been left behind, but whatever was inside had found a way to follow him. And now, every creak, every groan, every cold breeze reminded him that the dead were never far. The door was always open, waiting for him to return. He wasn't free. He had only delayed the inevitable. Emily Harper never imagined her life would take such a dark turn after what should have been a routine recovery. At 32, with a thriving career as a graphic designer, she'd always been independent, strong, and focused. That was, until the accident. A brutal car crash left her with fractured ribs and a concussion, enough to warrant a stay at St. Anne's Hospital. It seemed like any other hospital at first, cold, sterile, but nothing out of the ordinary. Yet, from the moment she was wheeled into her room, Emily couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. It wasn't just the stark white walls or the hum of machinery. It was the atmosphere. The air felt thick, almost suffocating. Lying in that stiff hospital bed, Emily's body ached in ways that made even the smallest movements feel like a monumental effort. But her discomfort went beyond the physical. There was a chill in the air, something unnatural that settled deep into her bones. She tried to tell herself it was the pain meds messing with her head. The doctors had assured her she might feel a bit off while recovering, and she was inclined to believe them. After all, hospitals could be unsettling for anyone, right? Still, the way the shadows seemed to shift in the corners of her room, it made her uneasy. As the hours dragged on, the feeling didn't pass. Emily found herself glancing at the door, half expecting someone or something to appear. The shadows weren't static. She'd catch them moving out of the corner of her eye, but every time she turned to look directly, they were still. It was unnerving. She pressed the call button for the nurse, trying to rationalize her fear. Surely someone could explain why the room felt so wrong. But when the nurse finally arrived, Nothing seemed out of the ordinary to her. "It's just your imagination, hon," she said, offering a reassuring smile that did nothing to ease Emily's growing discomfort. Trying to distract herself, Emily scrolled through her phone, catching up on emails and messages from concerned friends and family. Yet, no matter how much she tried to focus on her screen, her eyes kept drifting to the darkened corners of the room. That strange cold sensation only seemed to intensify, as if the very air around her was alive, pressing in closer. The room felt more and more claustrophobic, and soon, Emily found herself turning on every available light just to push back the shadows. But even with the brightness, she couldn't shake the feeling that something, or someone, was watching. Sleep didn't come easily that first night. Emily tossed and turned, haunted by a sense of dread she couldn't explain. Every time she closed her eyes, her heart raced, her skin prickling as though something was right next to her. The shadows crept closer in her dreams, enveloping her in their icy grip. By the time she woke up in a cold sweat, she wasn't sure if she'd slept at all. She told herself it was nothing, just stress, the meds, her mind playing tricks. But deep down, she knew something was terribly wrong in that room. The second day wasn't any better. The feeling of being watched only intensified, and now it wasn't just the shadows. Emily began to hear faint whispers at night, low and unintelligible, but undeniably present. She mentioned it to the nurse, who looked at her with a sympathetic yet dismissive smile. "Recovery can be hard on the mind," the nurse said, brushing off her concerns. Emily wasn't so sure anymore. What started as a vague sense of unease was growing into full-blown paranoia. Or was it? Something in her gut told her this wasn't just in her head. There was something else in that hospital room with her. And it was getting closer. Emily's sense of dread only deepened as the days dragged on, her recovery slower than expected. Each night the shadows seemed bolder, no longer lurking just in the corners of her room but creeping closer to her bed. One particularly restless night, she woke up abruptly, her heart pounding as though she'd just run a marathon. Her eyes flickered open, and there, standing at the foot of her bed, was the unmistakable figure of a man. He wasn't just a shadow anymore. He was real. Dressed in a long, dark coat, his face obscured by the dim light, he clutched something in his hand, something metallic and sharp. Her breath caught in her throat, and for a moment, she couldn't move. The figure stood motionless, yet his presence filled the room with an overwhelming sense of dread. Emily felt frozen, unable to scream, unable to even blink. The only sound was the faint, raspy breathing coming from the figure. Then, just as quickly as he appeared, he vanished, dissolving into the shadows. The air around her grew colder, and she could feel the hair on the back of her neck stand up. It was no hallucination. That man, whoever he was real, and he had been right there, watching her. The following morning, Emily couldn't shake the image of the dark figure from her mind. She tried to convince herself that maybe she had been dreaming, that her mind was playing tricks on her again. But the fear was too real. When the nurse came in to check on her, Emily hesitated before asking, "Has anyone else seen strange things at night? Like a man in the room?" The nurse's smile faltered for just a second, a flicker of something unspoken behind her eyes, before she quickly regained her composure. "I'm sure it's nothing, dear. Sometimes the medication can cause vivid dreams," she said, her tone gentle but dismissive. But Emily wasn't convinced. She noticed how the nurses would avoid meeting her gaze, how they seemed to hurry out of her room whenever they could. It wasn't just her imagination. Something about this place wasn't right, and the staff knew more than they were letting on. That night, the figure appeared again. This time, she was fully awake. She watched, wide-eyed, as the dark form materialized at the foot of her bed once more. His long coat swayed slightly as if caught in a non-existent breeze, and in his hand, glinting in the pale moonlight, was a scalpel. He moved closer, slowly, deliberately, as though savoring the moment. His voice, low and raspy, filled the room, though Emily couldn't make out the words. All she knew was that whatever he was saying, it wasn't good. The air grew even colder, a biting chill that seemed to seep into her very bones. She wanted to scream, to run, but her body wouldn't cooperate. It was as if the very presence of this figure had paralyzed her. And then, just like before, he vanished, leaving only the lingering scent of antiseptic and cold steel. Terrified and desperate for answers, Emily asked more questions the next morning. This time, the nurse's smile didn't reach her eyes. "It's best not to talk about things like that," she muttered, hurriedly adjusting Emily's IV. "Sometimes it's better not to know." That was all the confirmation Emily needed. She wasn't crazy. Someone or something was visiting her room at night, and it wasn't going to stop. Emily's desperation for answers grew stronger with each passing day. It wasn't just fear driving her now. It was the need to understand what or who was haunting her nights. The nurses weren't talking, but that didn't mean there were no answers to be found. She began asking around, speaking quietly to hospital staff, trying to piece together any clues. One night when the shifts were changing, a janitor, an older man who seemed less cautious than the others, finally let something slip. "You shouldn't be asking about Dr. Morrison," he whispered, his voice shaky. "He's been gone for years, but his presence... Well, some things don't stay buried." The name hit Emily like a jolt. Dr. Morrison, that was the connection. Over the next few days, she dug deeper, using her phone to search for any information she could find on this mysterious figure. What she uncovered made her blood run cold. Dr. Richard Morrison had once been one of the most respected surgeons at St. Anne's, known for his brilliance and unorthodox methods. But his reputation took a dark turn when a series of unexplained patient deaths started occurring under his care. Whispers spread of strange experiments, patients who went in for routine surgeries but never came out alive. As Emily read further, the true horror of Morrison's legacy began to unfold. He hadn't simply been a surgeon. He had been obsessed with pushing the boundaries of life and death. Rumors swirled that he conducted secret, unethical procedures, always in the name of science and progress. But the hospital had done its best to bury the scandal, covering up the deaths and quietly removing Dr. Morrison from his position. Officially, he had disappeared after being dismissed, but the more Emily uncovered, the clearer it became that his story hadn't ended there. It was the way the articles and forums described his disappearance that sent shivers down Emily's spine. There was no trace of him after he was dismissed. No one knew where he went, and then the unexplained deaths stopped. But according to hospital lore, Dr. Morrison's presence never truly left St. Anne's. Nurses and patients alike reported strange occurrences, whispers in the night, the cold touch of something unseen, and worst of all, sightings of a man in a long coat, holding a scalpel. The very figure that had been haunting Emily's room. Suddenly, everything made sense in the most terrifying way possible. The man she had been seeing, the one standing over her bed, whispering promises of healing, wasn't just some figment of her imagination. It was Dr. Morrison, or what was left of him. His ghost, or whatever twisted version of him remained, was still here, haunting the hospital, looking for new victims to continue his experiments. Emily's mind raced with fear and disgust. This wasn't just about the hospital's dark history anymore. She was part of it now. The weight of her discovery was almost too much to bear. Emily could feel her heart pounding, her throat dry as she realized the implications. Dr. Morrison wasn't finished. He was still operating, in his own way, from beyond the grave. The thought made her feel sick, but it also filled her with a grim determination. She had to find a way to get out of this hospital before she became his next experiment. That night, Emily couldn't shake the sense that something was coming. Her anxiety was palpable, filling the room with an oppressive tension that made every second feel like an eternity. She lay awake, staring at the ceiling, waiting for the inevitable. And then it happened, just as she feared. The room grew colder, the lights flickered, and that familiar, bone-chilling presence crept in. She didn't need to look to know who it was. Her entire body tensed as the air thickened around her, suffocating her with fear. She turned her head, her breath caught in her throat. Dr. Morrison stood there, no longer a distant shadow, but fully formed, his decayed face illuminated in the dim light. This time, he didn't stand at the foot of her bed. He moved closer, his hollow eyes locking onto hers as if he could see directly into her soul. The scalpel in his hand glinted ominously, dripping with something dark, something that looked all too much like blood. His voice was a raspy whisper, promising her salvation, a cure for all her pain. But Emily could see the malice in his eyes, the cold, calculated hunger. There was no cure, only death. His hand reached out, slow and deliberate, the scalpel hovering just inches from her skin. She tried to scream, but no sound came out. Her voice was gone, stolen by the terror that gripped her. Emily's body refused to move, paralyzed by the sheer weight of Morrison's presence. Her heart raced, every beat pounding in her ears as she felt the tip of the scalpel brush against her skin. It was cold, unnaturally so, and sent a shock of fear through her veins. In that moment, all she could think was that this was it. This was how she would die. Just another victim of Dr. Morrison's twisted experiments. She squeezed her eyes shut, praying for it to be over. But then, just as suddenly as he appeared, Morrison vanished into thin air, leaving only the stench of antiseptic and decay in his wake. Panting and trembling, Emily sat up, her body drenched in cold sweat. She stared at the spot where Morrison had stood, her mind racing to process what had just happened. It wasn't just a nightmare. She had felt the scalpel. She had felt his breath. It was real, he was real, and he wasn't going to stop. Desperate, Emily knew she couldn't stay another night in that hospital. Morrison's final cure was inevitable, and if she stayed, she would be his next experiment. But escaping wouldn't be easy. The hospital felt like a prison, its long, sterile hallways stretching on forever, and she couldn't shake the feeling that Dr. Morrison was always watching. She spent the next few hours wide awake, formulating a plan. As soon as the sun rose, she would make her move. She'd find a way to leave, discharge herself if she had to. But even as she plotted her escape, there was a gnawing fear in the back of her mind. Would leaving the hospital be enough? Could she truly escape Morrison's reach? Or had she already been marked by him? The questions haunted her, but there was no other choice. She had to try. Staying meant certain death. But what if Morrison wasn't bound to the hospital? What if he could follow her? With dawn approaching, Emily packed her things as quietly as she could. Her body ached, her head throbbed, but her determination overpowered the pain. She refused to be another victim. She wouldn't give Morrison the satisfaction. But as she gathered her belongings, something caught her eye in the mirror. Just for a second, a flash. A reflection of Dr. Morrison standing right behind her, his hollow eyes fixed on her. She spun around, but he was gone. Still, the message was clear. He wasn't done with her yet. Emily thought leaving the hospital would free her from the nightmare that had taken hold of her life. But that illusion quickly shattered. As soon as she stepped through the doors of St. Anne's, a wave of relief washed over her, but it was short-lived. The first night back home, something felt wrong. The familiar comfort of her apartment seemed off, colder, as if the air itself carried a trace of that hospital chill. Emily tried to brush it off, telling herself she was just being paranoid, that it was all in her head. But deep down, she knew. Dr. Morrison hadn't stayed behind. The signs were subtle at first. A flicker of movement in the corner of her eye, a shadow that seemed to linger just a little too long. She would catch her reflection in the mirror, only to see him, standing behind her, watching. Every time she turned around, he was gone. But the fear remained. She tried to convince herself it was her imagination, residual trauma from the hospital. But every night, the sensations grew stronger. The cold, that suffocating sense of being watched, and worst of all, the faint sound of metal scraping. It was unmistakable, the sound of Morrison's scalpel. Sleep became impossible. Emily would lie awake, her mind racing, her body trembling with anticipation, waiting for the inevitable. Every creak of the floorboards, every rustle of the wind outside sent her heart into overdrive. And then, the dreams started. Vivid, horrific dreams where she was back in that hospital bed, Morrison standing over her, whispering promises of eternal life, of healing beyond death. She would wake up in a cold sweat, gasping for air, only to find the room freezing, as if Morrison's presence had bled into her reality. It wasn't just her dreams anymore. He was here. Days passed, and Emily's life began to unravel. She couldn't focus on work, couldn't hold a conversation without her thoughts drifting to the horrors that plagued her nights. Friends called, concerned about her well-being, but she couldn't explain what was happening without sounding insane. How could she tell them that a dead surgeon was haunting her, that he was waiting for her, watching her every move? The worst part was, even during the day, she could feel him, the coldness, the eerie silence that would settle over her apartment like a thick fog. He was always there, lurking just out of sight. Desperation set in. Emily started researching anything she could find about hauntings, spirits, and how to rid herself of the malevolent force that had latched onto her. She visited psychics, priests, anyone who might have answers. But nothing helped. Each night the encounters became more intense. Morrison's face would appear in mirrors, in windows, even in the dark corners of her apartment. His whispers followed her everywhere, promising that he wasn't finished, that his final cure was still waiting. Emily realized with growing horror that Morrison hadn't just marked her, he had claimed her. By the time the second week rolled around, Emily had reached her breaking point. Exhausted, terrified, and hopeless, she barricaded herself in her bedroom, praying that somehow, some way, she could escape him. But as the familiar scrape of the scalpel echoed through the silence of her apartment, she knew there was no escaping Dr. Morrison. His experiments had transcended death, and now she was part of them. He was always there, lurking, waiting for the perfect moment to finish what he had started. And no matter how far she ran, how hard she fought, Emily knew one thing: the final operation was inevitable.